Hi there, I'm Dr. Simon Walker. I'm a military medical historian and suicidologist, and I currently teach history and politics at the University of Strathclyde and Glasgow Caledonian University. Moment of full disclosure, I'm excited to have been asked to give this lecture because, one, I get to talk about one of my specialisms, which is war in medicine, but also because I went to college at Kilmarnock campus, and without the amazing people there, I wouldn't be here getting so excited about history. So let's dig in. Starting with war in medicine, there's a complex relationship up until the First World War because disease kills more soldiers than wounds or combat. During the Napoleonic Wars, 1803 to 1815, soldiers in the British Army were 8 times more likely to die from infection than battle. And this is the same case for all of the British campaigns in the 19th century, including the Crimean War, 1853 to 56, the Zulu War in 1879, and the last Boer War, 1899 to 1902. At Bloemfontein in 1901, over 1,000 British soldiers died as a result of typhoid, and they ended up being just dumped into a mass grave. And this isn't just limited to the British. During the American Civil War, 1861 to 65, 2/3 of the 660,000 military deaths were from diseases such as pneumonia, dysentery, typhoid and malaria, brought on through the overcrowded and unsanitary conditions, lack of clean water, lack of good food, and absolute lack of fresh air. In the 20th century, this battle of lethality continued as innovation and the evolution of war stepped up to challenge disease for the title of most deadly. Wars and the way that they were fought changed after the introduction of total war, which is a term coined by historian Arthur Marwick. And this meant that the First and Second World War were all-encompassing, and they didn't just impact those who were fighting, but the civilians that they represented. Disease was able to spread through the movement of soldiers through the limited hygiene processes necessitated by war, such as in the trenches between 1914 and 1918, and by transference of disease back with soldiers, such in the case of venereal disease or influenza. This was carried by soldiers and often exposed vulnerable civilians whose immunities had been compromised by their personal experience of the war. Now it's here that we can talk about influenza, and it's never been more appropriate to talk about the influenza epidemic that followed the First World War between 1918 and 1920, as we're continuing to deal with the COVID crisis. At least hopefully it's going to be over soon. The spread of the Spanish flu bears remarkably similar societal, political and medical issues and actions as the current pandemic, all the way through to the use of media in presenting numerous conflicting theories and information about the disease, to the use of masks for prevention, and the inevitable counter-refusal by people to wear them. One of the most obvious forms of misinformation is the name of the disease itself. There's no evidence at all that the flu began in Spain. In fact, this is a myth, and it developed because the uncensored press within neutral Spain during the war meant that the rest of Europe only became aware of the disease by proxy because their government censored reports for maintenance of wartime morale. Spain, for example, called it something completely different. They called it the Naples soldier, on the belief that it had actually come from France. Several countries had their own villain nations to blame, including Brazil, Portugal and Senegal. Spanish flu relates to military medicine and disease because its transmission was linked to the mass movement of men across the world who carried it from the front lines to home. In much the same way that the air corridors of the 21st century provided ease of transmission for COVID, as did the troop movements of thousands of men on board ships. And the first known case of the flu was reported in Kansas on March 11, 1918. However, researchers currently suggest that it could have actually started in China, or in Britain, or indeed in France. The war made Spanish flu so much worse simply on the basis of mass movements and overcrowdings within the military camps and their overburdened medical facilities. Now this is made worse still by typically horrendous conditions on the front lines and the declining health of the fighting men. Its spread into the civilian population was just as damaging, as civilians in many countries had compromised immune systems as a result of war rationing, exhaustion and further impacts of war. Ultimately, over 500 million people were infected, and poor record keeping and the confusions of the final war years led to vastly different versions of the death toll, ranging from a conservative 70 million to potentially the deaths of over 100 million people. These numbers are questionable, but it is known that the Spanish flu killed at least 3 times as many as the First World War. Now this brings us quite nicely to talk about technology. The 20th century provides lots of new ways and exciting ways to kill each other, many of which were horrifically ingenious in not only the damage that they had on the body, but the lasting damage they had on the minds of those who survived or even just witnessed their use. At the turn of the century, shells and repeating rifles with a range of around about 900 yards were essentially the most destructive. But in just half a decade, mortars, high caliber shells filled with shrapnel, highly effective machine guns, and then a couple of decades later, aerial bombers, tanks, flamethrowers, thrown explosives and gases which drowned the lungs and peeled off the skin were used in combat. The next half century brought improvements to all of these, with the new inclusion of napalm, which is adhesive fire that can't be put out by water, improvised and much wider yield explosives, drone strikes and long-range missiles, and of course the whole of the 20th century is bridged directly in the middle by the discovery and use of the nuclear and atom bombs which devastated Japan at the end of the Second World War. However, as the lethal effectiveness increased, as did the medicalised responses to it. In the First World War, the Royal Army Medical Corps was initially overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the conflict, despite being one of the best and most ready forms of army medicine to take the field. However, within 12 months, the RAMC had become experts in the removal of the wounded, frontline triage and treatment, and assessment of immediate medical care, and the ability to keep their patients alive, which is always a good thing. In the Second World War, the RAMC returned to the fray with a great deal of experience and focused on training up men towards self-medical care while ensuring that medical services were well stocked and available. And they were able to do this because there were new technologies, such as blood transfusion. Now, blood transfusion is something that we just take for granted today. In 1914, this was one of the first issues because men were dying simply from loss of blood due to the increasingly brutal ways in which their bodies were damaged by bullets, bombs and shell bombardment. Blood transfusion in this period typically relied on an arm-to-arms transfusion, with a system of calling volunteers into hospitals when they were needed. It was only in 1900 that Karl Langsteiner discovered the role of blood groups, and the issue remained that blood just didn't keep long enough to be stored. In 1914, the discovery of the ability of sodium citrate as an anticoagulant led to a storages of blood being used in field hospitals from around about 1917 onwards. In 1918, US Army surgeon Oswald Robertson established the first blood bank capable of storing blood for up to 21 days. This is huge. By 1941, the situation was completely different. Technology and knowledge allowed for over 56,000 pints of blood to be exported for troops abroad. Linked to transference of blood is surgery. Again, as weapons became more devastating, the innovative forms of surgery continued to increase. Now, most famous of this is what's now known as reconstructive or plastic surgery, which was pioneered by Harold Gillies during the First World War. This Australian surgeon brought to the war an intuitive knowledge of cutting-edge surgery, no pun intended, and introduced new methods of transplanting and regrowing skin that saved the lives of thousands of British men who suffered facial and head traumas as a result of parapet shots over the trenches and shell shrapnel. Think about it. In the trenches, unless you were actually over the top, you mostly got wounds in this area. And the bullets would tend to go through the soft line of your face, hit the helmet behind and bounce back. You can end up with much of your face being devastated. And Gillies, creating a hospital in Queens in Kent, conducted over 5,000 successful surgeries to rebuild Jaws' faces and to treat gas and flame injuries. Now, this work served as the basis of an entirely new medical industry, but it came into its own in the Second World War because of the treatment for burns and crash injuries for pilots. Typically, in British planes, the second fuel tank is housed under the pilot seat in the Second World War, meaning an attack could lead to an explosion and pilots suffered second and third degree burns. They essentially roasted in their own cockpits. Gillies' invention of the two pedicle flap at the turn of the century was also influential because it redirected fresh blood from elsewhere on the body to stimulate reconstruction. Essentially, it was a tube of skin, peel of skin off, say, an arm, a leg, a thigh, and then it would be connected to where the dead skin, the necrotic skin, was. They would have their arm kind of permanently held up, and that would put fresh blood and help them to heal. It was an incredible discovery. Of the most incredible is probably penicillin. Without question, penicillin remains one of the most famous developments, not only in military medical history, but also in the history of medicine entirely. First discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1828, penicillin was rediscovered and developed again in 1939 by Howard Florey and Ernst Chain in Oxford. Their experience resulted in miraculous recoveries, treatment, and the healing of sores and wounds was quickly adapted through Fordian and assembly line practices for mass production in the USA. You may recognise the name Ford as Henry Ford, the great car manufacturer whose assembly lines were used to create penicillin, or at least the process was. By the D-Day landings, there were 3 penicillin shots to each soldier available, and by the collapse of Germany in 1945, deaths from infection fell to practically 0. Penicillin remains a medical marvel, as the progenitor of an antibiotic revolution in the second half of the 20th century. Its impact on civilian medicine has been widespread and has reduced fears of death through infection dramatically, as well as having significant impact on long-standing medical issues such as sepsis and venereal disease. Essentially, penicillin changed the medical practice and treatment of the human race in 1,000 effective and life-saving ways. Now, one of the other issues with military health is the ability, or often flat-out refusal, of personnel to do what they're told. In the First World War, this was an issue particularly in terms of self-sanitation, and indeed had been for centuries. In the 19th century, infections and disease could typically be traced back to poor sanitation conditions in the military and within civilian populations. Association with the need for separate drinking and sewage facilities, as well as clean living conditions and personal hygienes, were slow accepted practices prior to the 20th century. In the military, adoption to such practice took even longer as soldiers frequently revealed themselves according to convenience, not regulation. They ignored regulation about personal hygiene and often served in conditions that stopped them having the ability to bathe, change, or get clean water, get warm, or even have a good diet. One of the solutions to this disobedience, be it willful or unavoidable, was vaccination. Vaccination had first been discovered in the late 18th century and used to great success against smallpox, smallpox being the only disease to be completely eradicated. In the 19th century, vaccination was completely compulsory for everyone, including soldiers, but it was deeply In 1916, a new form of typhoid demanded an amended vaccine, and that was successfully rolled out in the British forces, with by the end of the war, 97% of the British forces being completely vaccinated against typhoid. It's difficult not to overstate this, because by the end of the First World War, from 1917 onwards, there are no typhoid deaths. In less than 20 years, we've gone from burying men in a mass grave to no deaths at all from this disease. Finally, I'm just going to quickly talk to you about the notion and issue of experimentation. As noted, the wars of the 19th and 20th century were often periods of innovation which both improved and destroyed the bodies of fighting forces. Experimentation upon those bodies remains at the extreme end of the discussion about the impact of war on medicine. In the 19th century, vaccines for typhoid and cholera were tested on British and Indian soldiers. During the First World War, British men were gassed in chambers at Porton Down facility in England in order to test their endurance of their bodies under attack and create better means of protection. The director of one of these facilities in Britain died soon after the end of the war as a result of continuous exposure to the deadly gases. The Sterling Gazette identified him as a hero who gave his life to experimentation. Porton Down facility remains famous in the journals of British military experimentation, with reports of over 20,000 men being experimented upon until 1989. Now, the big watershed moment came in 1953 after British airman Ronald Maddison died after being exposed to the nerve agent sarin. His death resulted in investigations decades later, which included men in 1999 claiming that they'd been forcibly experimented on, and an inquest was awarded £100,000 compensation for Madison's family in 2004. And of course, this isn't just limited to the British. As well as it's known, the Nazis conducted hundreds of experiments on members of the concentration camps to better their research into medical techniques, weapon development, execution methods, and solving health issues such as altitude and cold water tests, which were designed to improve the chances of survival for Air Force personnel. Essentially, they plunged inmates into cold water and saw how long it took them to die. Additionally, the American forces tested vaccines on soldiers, prisoners, and the mentally ill during the Second World War. They also exposed military personnel to atomic blasts, leading to long-term radiation poisoning for many. Now, ultimately, these acts resulted in the Nuremberg Code that came around at the end of the 1940s. However, long after the trial of the Nazi war criminals, similar experiments continued to be carried out in both Britain and America in direct opposition to the Nuremberg Code for the sake of military advancement and development. These experiments included spraying toxins across the British countryside, infecting an entire population with syphilis, and continuing to experiment on soldiers using narcotics and LSD, and documenting the effect. The conclusion to take away here remains the question of the extent to how far is war good for medicine. Now, this is a question that many historians have asked, particularly Professor Roger Cooter, and it's a question of cost of progress. There are loads of responses, but no one has come up with a definitive answer. What we can say is that clearly war did have an impact on medicine. Development of preventatives, knowledge of hygiene methods, development of new lethal technologies, and the opportunities for enhanced treatment, organisation, and rehabilitation post-injury are all evident. We can see this. But that doesn't mean that it's a good thing or a bad thing, necessarily. In truth, the answer is always going to be subjective, as the argument tends to get a bit circular. Without war, we may not have had the development, but would we have needed the development if we hadn't had the war, etc., etc. Ultimately, it's up to you. Additionally, the wars of the 20th century may have been proven as victories against disease, which they are, definitely. But they're also sites of mass slaughter as a result of advanced offensive technology, and the damages that those wars did to public health, not least including the Spanish flu epidemic. This is one of the joys of discussing this topic, if you find it joyful. I do, never mind. But because there isn't a clear answer here. What is clear is that medical progress and military action are linked in history. But wonderfully, and like many topics that you study in history and sociology and politics and literature and so on. It's ultimately up to you to decide, by doing the research, reading the books, reading the articles, and coming to your own conclusions, if the link between war and medicine was ultimately positive or negative. Thanks for watching this. I hope you found it interesting. There is more information connected to this video if you're interested, and good luck. Thanks, bye.